Excellent. Okay, welcome everyone to the Men's Club. I'm very pleased to welcome Jonathan Seidmann here today. Um, I think that you all probably know that John is my husband, but he also happens to have a wealth of knowledge about software, and I'm thrilled to welcome him here. So, John, on to you.
All right, thank you very much, Alana. So really today we're going to talk about a topic that sort of I find really interesting, and I really hope some of you do as well, and really all of you. I'm going to go through really kind of a few case studies about really major software failures that have occurred in the, frankly, fairly short history of software and software engineering. Uh, and for each of the case studies, I'll talk about sort of the software issues that came up, and really what can we learn from these, and what are some of the best practices. Kind of at the end of the presentation, I'll go through some of the best practices, so really how these issues can be avoided. By the way, this is not going to be super formal, so if anybody has any questions as we go forward, please let me know. Certainly I'll answer them as best as I can. And I think with each slide I'll ask if anybody has any questions, so there'll be time for lots of questions. Yeah, so the quote here is really, I think, one of my favorite quotes about software engineering. It's attributed to, it's called Weinberg's Law, that, if builders built buildings the way programmers wrote programs, then the first woodpecker that came along would destroy civilization. And I think, I'm sure all of us have really felt those problems, as every single one of us has used software that we found various issues in, or features that are not fully implemented. So in this talk, I'm really kind of going to go through some of the issues that have happened, and unfortunately, some of them have caused loss of lives, and some of them have just had, been near misses. And really, there's too many famous failures really to go through them all. So I kind of cherry picked, I think, 4 issues that I thought would be really most interesting, or that I found most interesting. So first, I thought I would really go into my background a little bit, so you could kind of get to know who I am, and really maybe a little bit about what my qualifications are. So early in my career, actually, I should say even before I started my career, I have a degree in electrical engineering from Boston University, kind of down the road. Um, Shortly after graduation, I started as an electrical engineering, working at a company that has since gone bankrupt, but working in landmine and bomb detection systems. For that, I did mostly electrical engineering, and really some very bare bones manufacturing work and systems engineering. I then really transitioned to developing embedded software and desktop software for in the oil and for sensors used in the oil and gas industry, specifically systems that measured viscosity, really primarily focused in the oil and gas industries, but a little bit of other industries as well. I got to see a lot of really amazing factories. I was at the Mercury Marine facility making boat engines, which I thought was really impressive. Um, and the software and electronics that I developed there, I mean, at this point, probably I left, I don't know, close to, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, is still used in a bunch of factories and oil fields across the world. After that, I worked on developing embedded software for lighting applications at Philips. Most of them were really for architectural entertainment purposes. And I kind of put some pictures here. There's a photo of the systems I worked with at the Empire State Building on the right, at the bottom right, which is still being used. I think it went live probably about 10 years ago, give or take. And also the new One World Trade Center in New York City, and the photos are there. And it was a great system to work on, a lot of fun, and really very high visibility. So I thought it was really just a lot of fun to work on. Currently, I work on developing software, primarily embedded systems for medical devices, for a small medical device startup in Lexington. Uh, and really, lastly, I would say my greatest qualification for holding this talk is really being married to Alana, who asked me if I had any ideas to give a talk around software for the Men's Club. So I hope you all enjoy this. Any questions for me before I dive in and get started? All right, guess not. Okay, so Alana, we're gonna ask just a fairly brief survey, just so I have an idea of people's software knowledge here, just so I know how to target this a little bit.
Can you see the answers, John?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Wow. I This is impressive. I think most people here have quite a bit of software background, which I think is very exciting. So, I mean, I'd be happy to, if anybody has any specific technical questions about some of these issues, I'd be happy to go through them in more detail for the people that are sort of more software based. Great. Perfect. So it looks like basically over really half the people here can program proficiently in over one language, and the remainder of the people are sort of scattered between the other two options, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Great. So, oops, sorry about that. So the first case study that I wanted to go through was the Therac 25. And some of you may have heard about this system in the past. And the Therac 25 was really the third generation of a computer controlled radiation therapy machine made by AECL. It was sort of based on the PDP-11 computer, which I suspect some of you are familiar with. It was initially released, the Therac 25 was initially released in 1983 and treated thousands of cancer patients without really any reported problems until the reports started cropping up with patients being severely harmed by the system starting in 1985. So really 2 years into the system launch, it started to experience severe software problems. And I wanted to read you one of the reports about one of the patients because I think this is really very scary. So from the report, it said, on March 21st, 1986, a patient in Tyler, Texas was scheduled to receive his 9th Therac 25 treatment. He was prescribed 180 rads to a small tumor on his back. When the machine turned on, he felt heat and pain, which was unexpected as radiation therapy is usually a painless process. The Therac 25 itself also started buzzing in a very unusual way. The patient began to get up off the treatment table when he was hit by a second pulse of radiation. This time he got up and began banging on the door for help. He received a massive overdose. He was later hospitalized for radiation sickness and died 5 months later. This is really tragic. Another patient reported seeing a bright light and heard eggs frying. He said it felt like his face was on fire. The patient died 3 weeks later due to severe radiation burns on the right temporal lobe of his brain and brainstem. So in all, there were at least 6 patients that were exposed to massive amounts of radiation that we know about. In total, there were 4 dead and 2 seriously injured, although these numbers are a bit, depending on which source you look at, the numbers are a little bit different. I think there are different reports of different patients. So, but in all, everybody sort of can agree on that there's definitely 4 dead due to this, although it's likely there may be others because these were all cancer patients. Some people, they were suspected of having increased radiation doses, but due to some of their short prognoses anyways, may have been impacted and sort of were not discovered. So internally, the company that made these, ACL, investigated some of these reports and thought maybe there was a hardware fault, and they looked at it internally and updated the electronics because I think they believed that there was internally a circuit board that controlled the switches. They thought maybe there's a fault in the switchboard. So they updated the electronics on every single unit in the field and really replaced them. And so here's where it gets interesting. Even after they replaced every single unit in the field, there were additional software failure, or there were additional failures in the field that patients reported and the operators reported. Patients really perceiving pain and getting additional doses, getting likely greater doses than they were expecting. And I think this is kind of one thing that's really interesting. There's a staff physicist at a cancer center. I believe this is actually at the cancer center in Tyler, Texas, with 2 of the harmed patients out of the 6, decided really to get to the bottom of this whole scenario. He thought, how could this have happened when the system was working so well for 2 years? Nothing had really changed. And also, how did it happen twice with one of the operators? There were several operators of the machine, even at that center, And so how come two of the harmed patients happened with one center, with one of the operator? And so the staff physicist at that cancer center decided he was going to basically lock himself and the operator. They were going to lock themselves in the room, and they worked several nights and through the weekend to try to get to the root of the problem. And frankly, and throughout the weekend, they really of debugging the system and trying many times in many scenarios to try to figure out what the heck happened. They found the root of the problem. So it turned out with a Therac 25, it was able to deliver radiation doses in two different modes. So the operator could sort of select two different modes. It was either X-ray mode or electron mode. But the physicist and the operator discovered that when they selected X-ray mode, it takes about 8 seconds to turn this turntable to select an appropriate radiation target. But if the operator quickly canceled X-ray mode and started electron mode before the 8 seconds was up, the turntable would not go back to the appropriate position. It would actually just stop. And it would be in the wrong configuration. And because the turntable was in the wrong configuration, it would result in extreme doses of radiation to the patient, in some ways, hundreds of times more radiation than was prescribed. So the physicist really then found another cancer center that had a similar machine, actually not the Therac 25, but one of the earlier units, and called them in Chicago and asked them to follow this procedure for making the unit fail, because they were able to repeatedly make the unit fail. So they called the other unit in Chicago and said, hey, follow these instructions. So, but when the unit in Chicago followed the instructions, the machine would not follow the same path and it wouldn't actually deliver the same units of radiation. Essentially, what happened was this tripped a hardware interlock, so a hardware failsafe on the machine, and actually would cause the system to blow a fuse, preventing the machine from delivering any dose at all to the patient. So this is kind of curious, the system to the cancer center in Tyler and the physicist, because he said, what? We don't have this hardware fail-safe in our system. So what happened? So in light of this, the cancer center in Texas really reported all these fail-safes to the company, and the company basically, and the FDA as well, and the machine was declared defective by the FDA and AACL. So AACL went back, and once they were able to determine what the true fault was, they fixed the software bug, and they put the system back into service. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, a different software bug appeared and killed another patient. And really, in response to this, shocking no one, the FDA basically took the entire, they exercised their authority, took the system off the market, and they basically said, you can't use this at all. And this is really the first major software failure in a medical device internationally. And in response to this, I think this really I think everybody can sort of see, this really scared both the FDA and the European regulatory authorities for medical devices. And an international software standard was put into effect regulating medical device software across the US and Europe. And today, the FDA takes a very close look at medical device software, especially ones that can cause harm to patients. And I can certainly go into details about this if anybody's interested. But I can kind of, what are the major software faults here that happened? Looking into this, there was actually a very substantial investigation that happened later in 1993. And if anybody's really interested in this, you can actually find the published investigation, which I thought was quite interesting. I looked at some snippets of it. So there were kind of a handful of major faults. The first one was there was only one person who wrote the software, and this programmer wrote the software for the first 2 generations of the system, not even the Therac 25. And he was the one that actually did all of his testing himself. Nobody else reviewed the software. And when the software was written, the program didn't even have access to the actual machine, which I thought was absolutely, it blew my mind. In fact, the real software and the real hardware were never actually combined until the machines were assembled in the hospitals, because the machines were very expensive and everything was running late. The programmer really only had access to various simulators at the office. So the programmer could never actually evaluate the true system. And while, it should be noted that while the previous versions of this product did have these bugs, they were never noticed in any improper configuration. Sorry, they were never noticed, since any improper configuration would blow a fuse, as I mentioned, and it would shut down the machine. And really, to save money and simplify the designs for the third generation, the Thearc 25, AECL decided, you know what, we're going to make the system a lot smarter, and we're going to make it simpler and save some money and complexity. And we're really going to take all these hardware fail safes and interlocks out, which I think was clearly to their detriment. And I think they really caused a major failure and major harm to these patients. Additionally, it should be noted that no failure mode analysis was done during this design at all. And this is sort of, I think, for everybody here who's done software professionally, especially for software systems that can cause harm, failure mode analysis is really sort of the cornerstone of any system design. No failure mode analysis was done during the design at all, thinking about what are the ways that the system could harm a patient and how do we sort of mitigate these in the safest way possible. And also, there was very little or no system level design done on the software itself. It was really just done sort of ad hoc. The programmer was told, okay, you need to control the system, and he just sort of went off and did it all himself. And I think for people here, I think would sort of be surprised to know the actual programmer who wrote this system really decided they were going to write their own operating system themselves, and didn't sort of use an operating system that had been used widely in the field at that time. And as I mentioned, there was an investigation undertaken in 1993, which I believe subpoenaed the source code and really took a very large look into this. And that investigation, I believe, is freely available. So I think it's really interesting to look through all the different source code. And they go into great detail about the race conditions that happen that cause this fault, as well as sort of the reason why the second failure happens after they fix the first one. They go into some great detail about this. And so lastly, I'll kind of say that working in the medical device space as I currently do, the story of the Thearc is really one that keeps every software engineer up at night. Nobody wants to be the person who causes a failure like this that would either harm a patient or even, kill a patient. I think that's something that really, frankly, keeps me up at night. And I think, I think everybody working on machines like this really take their job very seriously. And the FDA as well takes it very seriously, because nobody wants to be the FDA reviewer that allowed a system to go forward that later harms patients. So I think that's mostly all I have to say about this specific system. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next system?
I have a question of why more patients weren't harmed.
Oh, so it's a good. So the reason more patients weren't harmed is, so as I kind of mentioned, so if the operator really selected one mode, and then took their time and selected the other mode, everything was totally fine, because essentially when they selected a mode, there was this turntable that would rotate to sort of select whether the radiation beam would be spread or there would be an X-ray target. And to be honest, I don't understand all the different radiation configuration options. But essentially what happened is when they selected one mode, the turntable would start rotating. And if they selected one mode, waited 8 seconds, it would be fully in this other configuration. And then they select another mode, it would be all in this, it would go to the second configuration. The reason more patients weren't harmed is, as the system was used more and more frequently, the operators, as I'm sure people sort of understand, the operators got faster and faster and faster at using the machine, and actually would be able to type and set the configuration faster. So the operators, once they became really familiar with the system and using it for several years, day in and day out, they would select one mode, and then before the 8 seconds was up, they would select another mode. And if you did that, selected one mode and then selected the other mode very quickly, that's when the problems would happen. So it was only when the users did this configuration change very quickly. And in fact, I will say that sort of ACL, when some of these reports cropped up, they tried to reproduce this failure, but they could never reproduce it because they were sort of doing things very slowly and very methodically, and they were never able to reproduce the problem. It was only when the staff physicist and the operator who harmed 2 patients really kind of going through this and spending a bunch of time figuring this out, they were able to get to the root of the cause of this. That was only when you were able to select the configuration, then change the configuration very quickly, which was in a very small subset of the patients. Any other questions?
Yeah, just real quick,
Sure.
on MRI machines, is this the same case with them as well?
I would, it's a good question. I don't know the FDA classification for MRI machines. I will say any MRI machine that's in the field today is very, very, very regulated. And typically the FDA, so, and stop me if I'm going into way too much detail, but basically there's 2 major regulatory bodies. There's sort of the FDA and then in Europe. And we're governed by the FDA, which takes this very, very, very seriously. And the FDA's approach is anything that can harm a patient, and I suspect MRI is listed in this classification. There's either sort of minor, moderate, or major harm to the operator or the patient. The FDA basically says anything that can be mitigated, any danger that can happen must be mitigated as far as possible. And anything that is mitigated by software is not okay. They really say anything that can be mitigated by hardware must be mitigated by hardware. Now, the FDA is not, there's not 1,000 software engineers at the FDA that are going to comb through the software, but they really take a very close look. And there's a lot, depending on what your classification is, you have to provide them essentially reams of paperwork saying, this is all the failure mode analysis that we have done. So I would say, frankly, the likelihood of any danger like this happening today is very, very minimal. And I would imagine that any MRI machine in operation today is going to have hardware interlocks that basically say, okay, this is how the machine is going to be used. And it's all very carefully monitored, probably a lot by hardware itself and not by software. And I think, one tidbit of information that the FDA has released, which I thought was very interesting, was they sort of said, even though software failures seem like they're random, software is not random. Software failures do not occur randomly. Software failure will happen when all the inputs happen, it will cause the same output. Meaning, when a failure happens, it is not random. It is because all the different failure conditions and all the different failure modes happened. So things are, although they may feel random, they are not in fact random. Any other questions before I move on?
I have a question or comment.
Sure.
I worked for the computer company that made the computers for the first MRI and CAT scan machines.
Oh, great.
Yeah, CAT scan machines were first. General Electric, by the way, was the company, and it was around 1983, and then several years later, the MRI. CAT scan machines have a radiation source like X-rays, and they work by taking image slices, and that's why the clicking and the rotate, whatever. But MRI machines are just tickling your atoms with very strong magnetic fields. And so the major concern on if you go regularly, Siggy, if I pronounce your name correctly, in MRI machines is they want to make sure you don't have an implant or you don't have something in your clothes that's gonna yank it into the machine. And there's been cases where someone did something stupid, like bring a chair into the room, and next thing you know, it flies into the middle of the donut. Okay, very, very strong magnetic fields, but not but not harmful radiation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just out of curiosity, Harvey, are you familiar with what the level of concern is? So you said you worked on an MRI machine. Do you know what the FDA level of concern was for MRI machines?
I was behind the scenes in
I
terms
see.
of the software that was developed to run the corporation and the engineering departments
I
and
see.
coordinate them. And
Okay.
so, I didn't actually work on the machines, but I did get multiple stories. When they started working on MRI machines, they didn't realize if you were within 200 feet of the machine that your credit cards got wiped, the magnetic stripe.
Oh, interesting.
Everyone a memo went around. If you go in, leave all your credit cards at home.
I believe it.
That's
Great.
how strong, and they didn't, when they were developing the first MRI machines, they didn't really know how to contain the radiation in a room. I
Oh,
mean,
interesting.
it's simple, you put iron around it or whatever.
Sure.
But they were a lab, so they didn't know.
Great. Thank you. All right, I'll move on to sort of the.
We have
Sorry, go ahead.
a few questions that came in. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
The first question is the decision which mode to use done by the operator or by the physician?
Oh, that's a good question. I would imagine. So that's a good question. I'm not entirely positive, but I would imagine that essentially there's going to be notes in the chart done by the physician, basically saying this is for a machine like this, saying like, hey, this is the amount of radiation. This is which mode the system needs to be in, and then that would then be entered into the machine by the operator. Now, typically, I mean, I don't know how the Therac worked. I imagine it was sort of done very manually for the Therac, but I imagine nowadays all this is largely very much controlled, and there's a lot of checks to make sure that nothing that the operator enters is outside of various bounds. Okay.
Thank you. And the next question is this problem happening in any other fields such as cars or new computers?
The answer is absolutely. In cars, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I think that one thing I was debating putting in here, which I decided not to, was sort of if anybody remembers, I forget exactly what year, but the Toyota's unintended acceleration problems. The reason I kind of didn't put that in there, that was never fully determined what the root cause was, to my knowledge. There were people that said they did actually subpoena the source code for the entire Toyota drive-by-wire system, and they basically said theoretically there may have been scenarios that caused this, but there was never any analysis done to show that that's true. I mean, the answer is absolutely. This has been, I mean, software problems are endemic to other systems. I will say medical devices, regulated industries, primarily, automotive, defense, medical devices. I'm probably missing a couple here, but those industries, probably the failure rate and software failure rate is substantially lower than other industries because they are heavily regulated. Now, problems still happen, but I would say the problems that have happened in systems in those regulated industries are substantially fewer than other industries. I mean, if you look at various computers and things like that, how many people have had their computer crash? I would imagine almost probably 100% of us have had computer crashes in the last, in our lifetime, certainly. But also our computers aren't running our pacemakers, right? For systems like pacemakers or ventricular assist devices, there are massive safeguards in place to make sure that these problems don't happen. I think I should probably go to the next slide. So the next unit, obviously defense industry, is a Patriot missile. In 1991, in the Persian Gulf crisis, the Patriot missile batteries were widely hailed for their effectiveness in destroying incoming Iraqi Scud missiles. They were deployed throughout the Middle East to protect areas such as the airfields and seaports in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And really, during this time, one Scud missile was flying towards Israel and it was shot down by the Patriot missile. However, after the Scud missile was shot down, scientists were sort of analyzing the high-speed tapes in log files of the event and discovered that the accuracy, that while the Scud was shot down, the accuracy of the system was not what it should have been. And they suspected that it was because the Patriot missile had the Patriot missile battery had been on for 8 hours, and they suspected that as the cause. The military sort of looked into this fairly closely and updated their procedure and told every unit, or they instructed every unit to reboot the systems at 8-hour intervals until a software fix could arrive for these systems. Unfortunately, as you can see here, the units at Dhahran were not notified about this change of procedure. There was a U.S. military barracks there that was essentially covered by 2 different Patriot missile batteries, but one of the units was taken offline due to intermittent radar issues. So the other unit was kept online to protect the units. And because that unit had essentially been online for over 100 hours straight, when an Iraqi Scud missile was launched in their direction, because it had been on for 100 hours straight, the Patriot missile battery essentially was looking at the wrong part of the sky for the Scud and failed to intercept it, causing the Scud impact and really causing the death of 28 soldiers and wounding 100 more. So what really happened here? So this was all caused by a software bug in the Patriot missile that slowly reduced the accuracy of the system the longer it was powered on. And the root cause is really the system internally maintained a timer that kept track of how long the system had been on, sort of the time since the last boot up. And it stored this value really in different places of the software is a floating point value, incrementing by 0.1 for every 10th of a second that it had been on. And I think for those who are familiar with software are probably fairly familiar with floating points, and computers really are not, unfortunately, not really great, or sorry, computers are great at storing whole numbers, but storing decimal values, there's a lot of different numbers that they can't do so perfectly. And in this case, 0.1 is actually sort of the canonical example of a number that can't be stored perfectly. So each time the timer added 0.1, it was really adding this other number here. As you can see, it was like 0.1, a bunch of trailing zeros, and 9.5. And this value kind of depends on which format of floating point numbers it was stored. So the longer that the system had been on, instead of incrementing by 0.1, it would drift by this extra little trailing amount. So if the system had been on for 8 hours, the drift in accuracy was noticeable, as sort of the scientists noticed after the Israeli Scud missile takedown, but it wasn't really a problem. It would still be able to take down the system. The longer that the system had been on, the greater the drift in accuracy, until, with a system in Dhahran where 100 hours straight produced a critical failure of the system, and it was incapable of actually detecting the Scud missile. So in fact, the system was really only designed to stay on for 14 hours at a time. That was actually the requirement, at which point it was to be expected to be shut off for routine maintenance. However, during the Persian Gulf War, these systems were regularly on for 20 hours at a time. And in this case, even longer. The military commanders decided, we can't risk taking the system down to reboot it, or for any sort of routine maintenance. We have to keep it on to watch over the units. And so looking at this, what can we really learn from this? First of all, there's a major error in the design of the system. In different parts of the system, they used fixed point, and in different places they used floating point. And so using this imperfect floating point error caused the inaccuracy to drift over time. And this was sort of not caught. The second lesson is that since the system was only designed to stay on for 14 hours, it was never actually tested for durations longer than this. In fact, when the system was actually thoroughly tested, and I forget actually who the manufacturer of the Patriot missile was, but when the system was tested, it was actually tested fairly thoroughly. At the beginning of every single test, the test case said, okay, turn the system off and turn it back on again. So it was never actually tested for very long durations. So those are sort of the major implications. So even though the system had been tested very thoroughly, it was never tested for very long periods of time. So, all right, that's largely what I have for the Patriot missiles. Does anybody have any questions pertaining to this unit? Okay. I'll give people a second if they have any questions. Okay. All right. I'll move on to the next slide. So this, when I was researching sort of different failure modes and different case studies for this talk, this is one that I actually had not heard about previously, and I thought was actually really fascinating to me, and one that was really sort of not famous per se, but it really was one that I thought was so interesting to me. So this is the Los Alamos criticality experiment, and actually, relatively recent in software terms. So in 1998, researchers were bringing two subcritical chunks of radioactive material closer together slowly in a criticality experiment to measure the rate of change and neutron flux between the two halves. Depending on the source, this was either plutonium or uranium. Plutonium or uranium, I couldn't sort of get a straight answer. Different sources say different things. And as some of you know, if two fissile nuclear materials get too close, it can cause a chain reaction that, depending on various factors, can be extremely dangerous, can cause a meltdown. So really, to prevent this from happening during this experiment, each of these radioactive pieces were mounted on small controllable cars, kind of like a model railroad. And there was an operator that was working remotely using essentially a joystick to slowly and carefully move the units closer and closer together, so measurements could be taken. And really, the experiment proceeded normally for a time. Everything was moving carefully, and the operator was really moving the cars closer and closer together at a snail's pace. Suddenly, both of the cars picked up speed and careening towards each other at actually full speed of the railway cars. The operator, of course, really probably thoughts of a mushroom cloud sort of going through his head. The operator pulled back on the joystick, but nothing happened. And the cars kept going closer and closer together. Then the operator hit the shutdown button on the joystick. The cars didn't stop. They kept moving. They kept accelerating, actually. Finally, the operator initiated what's called a scram, but a separate emergency shutdown of the entire experiment that was separate from the joystick. Thankfully, that caused the cars to stop moving and actually pull away from each other. There's an emergency fail-safe that was separate from the joystick. So really, what happened to cause this? Turns out, as I think you may not be surprised, the joystick had failed. The processor reading the data from the joystick, really reading which position the joystick was in, recognized that the joystick itself had failed and sent an error message to the main controller reading the joystick data. And when the joystick failed, the joystick sent an error condition, which in this case was just an ASCII question mark for those of you who are sort of familiar with software. Unfortunately, the main controller interpreted this ASCII question mark not as sort of an error condition, but interpreted it as a large number, really the ASCII number, and started to move the cars as fast as they could possibly go towards each other. And really, when Los Alamos looked into this after the fact, they found out that 2 or 3 years prior to this experiment, the computer system, I suspect on the main controller, although it's hard to really find, had been replaced. And during that process, the programmer had disabled some of the crucial fail-safes in the code. And because they removed the crucial fail-safes in the code, it was unable to interpret the question mark as a special case and just treated it as a high velocity number for the cars to use. So really looking at this, what are the lessons that we can kind of take away from this? First is everything must be tested, especially air handling conditions. Secondly, for the systems that can cause harm, any code changes and any configuration changes should really be carefully reviewed. And this would definitely have been caught, the removal of the safety error code, the error handling code. And sort of after the fact, Los Alamos did say that there was never really any danger because there was, mechanical limitations. But they do acknowledge that it's definitely serious elapses occurred in both these systems that cause this problem. Any questions on this case? Okay. So this is the last case study I have here, which is the 737 MAX. And I think since this is a relatively recent event, I suspect a lot of you are obviously very familiar with some of the details in this. And I won't go into all the technical details, but I'll provide sort of a brief overview. To compete with the Airbus A320, Boeing decided to redesign the 737 to have better fuel economy per seat. And to really do this, they decided that they needed to increase the size of the engine. But because they decided to increase the size of the engine, they had to make a few other trade-offs. One of them was they had to move the location of the engine itself. And they had to move the engine higher up and also forward of the old position. And because this new position was less stable than the old position of the engine, there was an increased risk of the plane stalling under certain conditions. And like a lot of the companies, and I think a lot of people here who've done software in the past would sort of understand, Boeing figured, let's fix this in software, and created their MCAS system. And I won't go into the acronym. It's like maneuverability, control system essentially. But the MCAS system takes readings from the airspeed, altitude, and angle of attack. And when it determines the angle of attack on the airplane, which is sort of, I believe, the angle of the nose compared to, I believe, the incoming, really the angle of the nose. And I think there's also takes into account the angle of the incoming wind speed. And I think if anybody here is a pilot, they may know a little bit more about this than I do. But when the angle of attack was too great, the MCAS system would command the plane to lower the nose. Unfortunately, on Lion Air flight JT610, the MCAS system shortly after takeoff, the MCAS system kept forcing the plane's nose down, even when there's really no danger of the plane stalling. The pilots really tried to correct this by pulling on the yoke of the plane to bring the nose higher, but the MCAS system would then re-engage and kept pushing the yoke back down. The MCAS system, the pilot kept struggling back and forth, really kind of going in this back and forth oscillating pattern until the pilot really was overpowered, and the plane unfortunately crashed. It is really and it's believed that the Ethiopian Airlines crash happened basically under the exact same scenario. Looking at the flight data recorded after the fact for this, it appears that essentially one of the angle of attack sensors was very unreliable. I believe the difference so there are two actually angle of attack sensors, one on one side and one on the other side. And depending on who is flying the plane, the pilot or the co-pilot, the MCAS system would only read the angle of attack sensor on that side. And one faulty sensor could lead to disastrous scenarios by engaging and pointing the nose down and crashing the plane when a faulty sensor occurred. Now, MCAS was really a very unique piece of software in civilian aircraft. I think something similar had been in place for military aircraft, but it was not something that had been in civilian aircraft ever before. And it was only running on anything like the 737 MAX planes. And because of that, the pilots were not aware of the system at all. And Boeing really felt like there was really no concern because they programmed the MCAS system to only move the stabilizer, move the MCAS system 2.5 degrees, which is actually a fairly minimal. Unfortunately, what they did not take into account was in this scenario where the pilot was pulling and then the MCAS was pushing and they were sort of fighting back and forth and the MCAS was getting disengaged and re-engaged and disengaged and re-engaged, the 2.5 degrees would sort of keep compounding on itself. Every time it would re-engage, it would be 2.5 degrees on 2.5 degrees on 2.5 degrees and so forth until the plane could be put in the full downward position, but caused by the faulty angle of attack sensors. And so really, what is a major failure here, especially the major software failure? So first, one of the major failures, and I think sort of everybody here is familiar, like this is a heavily regulated industry, especially with Boeing. One of the first failures, the MCAS was sort of deemed as a fairly minor corrective system, since it could only correct 2.5 degrees in the plane. Unfortunately, nobody at Boeing and the systems engineers never really considered the possibility that the pilot would be fighting the system and the correction would be compounded on itself so many times that it would cause a crash. And since it was deemed as a minor corrective system and not as a critical system, remember they thought it could only correct 2.5 degrees. It relied on only one of the 2 angle of attack sensors. For more critical systems, two of the different sensor readings would be compared to see if one may be in error. In fact, I actually was talking to one of my coworkers about this yesterday, because he was actually worked for a subcontractor for Boeing, and he was sort of fascinated by this because he had actually worked on Boeing systems, and he said, you know, in any critical system, anytime there was anything relied on a sensor, multiple sensors would have to sort of vote, if you will, and were evaluated to evaluate the outcome, and that was sort of taken very carefully considered. Additionally, there was really no easy way for the pilots to turn off the MCAS system. In fact, on many planes, systems such as this are automatically turned off if it detects the pilot is fighting against it. And this is really not true for the MCAS system. In fact, the opposite was even true. The interesting thing about the MCAS system is if the pilot engaged autopilot, the MCAS system was actually turned off. It was only engaged if the pilot was engaging the plane manually. So in this scenario, essentially the pilot was, the input of the pilot was not trusted, and the pilot was effectively fighting the MCAS system. And the pilot did not know of any way in these 2 flights. The pilot did not know of any way to shut off the system. There were other reports of different flights where the pilots did actually fight the system and then literally were able to pull the fuses out of the certain systems in time to actually prevent catastrophic failure. I mean, there were in this system really too many procedural issues to really go through all of them one by one, but it's sort of clear that due to the time pressures and cost pressures, Boeing decided to rush the certification of the entire system, and really no proper review was performed by a large team either internally at Boeing or through the FAA. In fact, I think I won't go through this at all, but there was, you know, Boeing and certain other companies are able to in some ways self-certify their systems, and they didn't have to go through, like they were able to certify their systems themselves without having full FAA overview. And really looking at this from a higher level, we sort of see the problems that led to this. Competition from Airbus led to a redesign of the airplane for better fuel efficiency. And to be able to compete quickly, Boeing made it so their pilots didn't need to be specially trained. Oh, the new location makes it less stable. Add a software fix to compensate. And then a faulty sensor coupled with buggy software led to both of these crashes, really. So where does the root cause lie for these crashes? I mean, the truth isn't so simple. Is this really a minor software bug? I mean, there are multiple links in the chain, from, you know, essentially management decisions to make this change, to mechanical decision of repositioning the engine, to lack of systems engineering planning for the entire systems, to software failures of like disengaging and re-engaging of MCAS that allowed it to kind of compound the impact of the system. I mean, looking at this case study, I mean, it sort of as a software engineer working in this field, and especially embedded systems for you know, about 20 years at this point, you know, this feels very familiar to me. You know, almost every single system I have ever worked on has had hardware issues, and really hardware issues that I've had to fix or work around in the software. Fixing hardware problems in itself can take a long time, and it can be very expensive, as I think everybody here knows, especially in regulated industries. If the hardware needs to be reclassified through various testing laboratories. It can be very time consuming and very expensive. So a lot of times a software workaround or a software fix, if you will, is sort of the preferred approach a lot of the time. However, sort of as we see from this case study and really all the case studies, software doesn't always work. And in many cases and in many ways, it's really harder to find all the problems in software than is in a hardware system. So it's really, it's a lot easier for various issues to sort of be hidden in a software problem than they are in sort of comparable software systems. Any questions about the system or maybe other units before I move on?
Yeah, I just had a quick one.
Absolutely.
On the MCAS system, this was kind of a failure on side of Boeing, of course.
Yes.
But the major problem was, I mean, they didn't anticipate this problem, of course.
Correct.
So, but it did happen, and they didn't train their pilots correctly either.
Yes.
And the MCAS system puts input into the stabilizer.
Yeah.
And runs the stabilizer. And the thing that they wanted them to do, and it didn't tell them, is that you turn off the stabilizer. And there's two switches on the pedestal right beside their leg in the cockpit, and you just turn the stabilizer off, and you can move it manually with a wheel right between them.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And that could have saved the crash. That couldn't save the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But it would have saved the crash, because they have a condition on airplanes from years ago where they call it a runaway stabilizer.
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
If there's a runaway stabilizer, you take those two switches, you turn it off immediately, and they're trained to do that. But in this case, they just got confused, and they weren't properly trained really to do what they would do,
Right. In this case, and I think in some of the other cases as well, I mean, I think one of the problems is the pilots, this problem was happening. The pilots sort of were very unclear. What was actually fighting them in the system? They weren't really even aware.
That's correct.
Yeah. I mean, because that's sort of antithetical to a lot of the system. I mean, this is, as I mentioned,
but if they would have turned off the stabilizer, it would have saved the airplane.
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, looking at after the fact, yeah, you're right. They could have turned off the stabilizer. They could, even if they had engaged autopilot, that would have actually counterintuitively disabled the MCAS system as well.
And the other item concerning airplanes and the FAA is that Boeing is actually the ones that design it, and they know everything about it. And a lot of times with the FAA, they just don't have the talent to do everything they should be doing.
Right. Yeah, it's a very good point. And this is something I hadn't really put together in a slide, but I think it's a really good point. I mean, at some point, I personally haven't worked in aviation myself, so I'm not super familiar with the regulatory aspect of it. But, I can speak to medical devices. But, for example, the FDA doesn't look at any code I've ever written. They will never look at my code. And the FAA is somewhat similar. But at the end of the day, the amount of code going in to, let's say, a typical Boeing airplane, I have to imagine is at least tens of millions of lines of code. Yeah. And it is harder to review code than it is to write it. Yeah. So it's largely impractical for the FAA to actually review the code itself. I think, but they sort of take the approach a lot of the times that they are reviewing and frankly, very carefully the design processes that led to that code.
Yeah. Keep in mind also that the airplane is certified in the US by the FAA.
Yes, that's true. That's a fair
Every country that buys that airplane, they have to recertify it for the country. So whatever country you're going to, it has to certify it, and they just go by what they're told, basically. What the FAA has done.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Go ahead.
Sorry.
That's a very good point.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, Siggy must have watched the same documentary that I did, but I'm sure he knows more. He sounds like he's a pilot. I think the The problem in general is with government regulation, and Jonathan, you constantly say it's highly regulated, is there's no way in the world the people who are doing the regulation really understand the nuts and the bolts of what's in the device. A friend of mine worked locally in the FDA office. He was responsible for approving IV machines.
Mm-hmm.
And that killed lots more people than your radiation machine did.
Yep.
But there's the hardware and the software that you do, but then the design of the user interface. I get IVs all the time. I think we're using a Philips right now. You're working for Philips?
Me? Are you asking me?
I thought you were at one point.
I previously worked at Philips, but not for medical devices. I worked at Philips doing LED lighting. So thankfully there was zero danger of harming anybody. I work now at a small medical device startup in Lexington.
Imagine being a patient getting a dangerous drug administered and watching the expressions on the face of the nurse and the doctor trying to understand the user interface of the IV pump. Okay. And so, you know, the user interface is important, and every aspect of the system has to have checks and balances.
Yes.
And the operator is a very important part of that.
I will sort of say, you know, one thing to I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, at the end of the day, the FDA, you know, these regulatory bodies do provide some oversight, but at the end of the day, there's only so much they can do. But you bring up a really kind of good point about user interface. Previously, the FDA did not have any real requirements around user interfaces and anything of that nature. I will say the last several years, and I'm not sure how far back this goes, probably the last 2 or 3 years. So this is all relatively recent. The FDA is very critical of design of user interface designs. And they actually require that every single company that has a user interface, especially for systems doing like IV pumps or anything that can damage a patient. So I suspect IV pumps are listed as a major level of concern. So they all have to really show documentation that they have put in a lot of thought, and they've done a tremendous amount of like what they call user needs testing and usability testing around the user interface to make sure that it's sort of simple and easy to use. And there's a whole processes for how they do that. And so the FDA is now taking this very seriously. That being said, you know, no system is perfect. You know, there's sort of limitations on what the FDA or the FAA or other regulated environments can really do. You know, but I think they are moving in the right direction. They certainly take it very seriously, because nobody wants to be the person that approved, as you said, like an IV pump that is difficult to use, and then find out that it was responsible for the deaths of people because the nurses didn't use it. And there's a whole lot of like user needs testing that they have to do now. As I'm sure as anybody who's ever been in a hospital realizes, the amount of beeps and boops that you hear all the time is just overwhelming. And it really sort of causes what they call, like, I think, alarm fatigue. And the nurses a lot of times they say they don't even hear the alarms because they're just going off all the time. So the FDA takes now a much more critical approach with various alarms to show like what's a critical alarm versus what's maybe sort of like a minor issue. So I thought maybe I kind of go through my last slide here, and then we can kind of open up to some more general questions. And really, how can a lot of these issues really be avoided? I mean, I think a lot of them stem from systems engineering, really design. You know, take this large problem of what does the system actually need to do, and break it into smaller pieces and think about how should this small pieces work and how do these different pieces interact with each other. And everything the system should do needs to be documented. I mean, every requirement, meaning like what is the actual system supposed to be doing, has to be tested on its own, especially for critical systems. All the requirements need to be tested to make sure that it's actually satisfying those requirements, especially everybody here who's worked on software sort of probably very familiar with that. Additionally, every time the code is changed, It really should be reviewed by other experienced professionals. Kind of an amazing story that I heard at a seminar by Jack Gansel. And if anybody, I don't know if anybody is sort of familiar with him, he's sort of a bit of a guru in the embedded system space. You know, Jack Gansel talks about how code reviews lower bug rates by huge numbers, anywhere from like 75 to 90%. They lower the bug rates in various systems. And he said people go up to him. He said people would ask him, if that's the case, how come when we're doing these code reviews, we're actually not even finding that many bugs? But how is it that you say that they're reducing bug rates by 75 to 90%? Well, it really turns out that when programmers or software engineers know that their software is going to be reviewed by a whole team of people who are sort of like experts in the field, and they're going to be going through them line by line, they're really going to be looking through, and when they're going to be developing their code, they're going to be doing it with a more critical eye, and they're not going to take shortcuts, and they're going to be a lot more careful because they don't want to look bad in front of their peers. So just the fact of sort of knowing that the system is going to be reviewed by their peers and analyzed critically, that in and of itself lowers the bug rates quite substantially. Sort of it keeps, I would say, like kind of keeps the honest people honest. So lastly, as I mentioned, documentation. Like people leave jobs, people start on jobs, and it's very critical that the software engineers document how the system works, why, not only how does it do it, but why does it do it? So people taking over systems are sort of familiar with the systems. I mean, I think with every single one of these scenarios, and I specifically think to the Therac 25, that programmer that actually was there at the Therac 25 did not actually program the third generation, the Therac 25. I believe they were only there for the first two generations of the system. And they left the company. They basically used that same code on that system, but they just took out the hardware mitigations, or they took out the hardware fail safes in place. So that nobody ever thought like to look at the code and basically look at it with a more critical eye of like, how is it doing what it should be doing? What are the different failure modes, and what is the documentation that needs to be in place, and why is it doing, and how is it working? So really, that's basically everything I have. Thank you all so much.
There's a few questions that came in. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Happy to answer any questions.
No, that's 10:30.
That's totally fine with me. Yes.
Well, it's a comment. We have a comment, a quick question, and then a big question. So I'll start with the comment. The comment is, I think today you are developing using existing tools. So you have software on top of software and top of software. So your code relies on many existing tools, which makes testing and problem detection very complex. That's a comment from an engineer.
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. And I can kind of go through that a little bit. I mean, the answer to that is absolutely. I mean, I think there is, yes. And so I think people have to be very careful. Anytime you're using things that use other systems, like I kind of think like there are countless examples of people using, Linux, for example, Linux operating system, and writing applications on Linux systems. It doesn't absolve the people designing the system of saying like, oh, the system that I'm using must be perfect. You really, I'm not sure what the parlance is for airplanes or things of that nature, or auto manufacturers, but there's sort of in medical devices, there's what they call like software of unknown provenance. Like you're basically using the software. How do you know that it's doing what it's doing? And if it fails, how do you mitigate that? So there's a lot of discussion about that, but it's absolutely true. I mean, you're really building every software comes in many, many layers.
Thank you. This is a question, I don't know if you'll know the answer. Getting back to the Patriot missile.
Yes.
Iraq tried to get Israel involved by firing Scud missiles there. Did Israel already have Patriot missiles?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know at least one Scud missile launched from Iraq into Israel was shot down by the Scuds, but I having actually been to Israel after the Gulf War, I remember actually, ironically, there was a marketplace that had been hit by a Scud missile, and they literally years later, they had a inflatable missile literally on a market tent showing this is where the Scud missile hit. So it was used oddly enough as a bit of a tourist attraction, if you will. I don't know if the Patriot missiles themselves were deployed in Israel. That I'm not familiar with.
A whole other area of discussion, but it was part of my childhood work. The way Patriots, the way the Iron
Dome, yep.
Iron Dome works is the radar doesn't get involved. We see from outer space that a little teeny rocket, literally a firecracker from 23,000 miles in outer space.
Oh, interesting.
That was the technology that I worked on when I was 16 years old. And so, believe it or not, and for those people who happen to be Jewish and worry about people in Israel, is they have bunkers all over the place. And the real value of the Iron Dome system is when my little satellite says, oops, there's a rocket launched, and instantly determines the direction, but not necessarily, you don't know with rockets what the distance is that people jump into the bunkers. The Patriot system they've been working on for years has like a 5% success rate still.
Yeah, right.
And it's because, and I won't go into the details, and I only knew this because after the Air Force did a documentary, which I was involved in, a couple of White House consultants called me and explained to me, is that, if you think of the old days where two people had pistols in duels, okay, how difficult would it be to get both bullets traveling at thousands of feet per second to come end to end and hit each other?
Right.
Okay, pretty difficult to do. That's old technology. But those Scud missiles are traveling at roughly 4 times the speed of a bullet, and it's very, very difficult to even get close. And so it's very, very difficult technology to do what the Patriot is trying to do. So the software bugs are sort of the least of their problem right now, but we're still working on it, and they have them deployed so they can learn from experience and improve the systems. But you got to get it within a certain distance, and the explosive from the Patriot is radial from the tip, and the idea is to get the debris from that, to get the offensive missile to go through that debris. Okay,
great.
It's very, very difficult to do. But what triggers that whole process is we have satellites in outer space that see everything that goes on.
Oh, interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Harvey.
Harvey, did I hear you say a 5% success rate?
Yes. A gentleman called me up who happened to be a national security, a former national security advisor that was a professor emeritus at MIT. Okay, and part of the story the Air Force told about me had to do with MIT. So he gave me a call, and he sent me some short video clips, and you could, without any instrumentation, he could look up if he was underneath and see the actual burst and collision, whether it was really a collision or whether it was successful or not. And he was making noise about the fact that they're not being successful. Okay, in the case of Scuds, it turns out it takes a lot of technology to go into outer space and then come back without burning up. Most of those Scuds basically never got to the explosive phase. They were still in the process of disintegrating when they hit the ground. And the explosion is if you take something at 4,000 miles an hour and you hit the ground, there's a big boom without any explosives. And so there's a recent story in 60 Minutes about intermediate ballistic missile attacks on the base in Iran. And they had no defense for that. But they got the signal from the satellite that says, find a place to hide. And and no one got killed. And so that's a critical part of that.
I'm really puzzled. Are you saying it was a 95% failure rate?
Well, not really failure rate. It's a question of really disabling the incoming missile. This particular guy told me 5%, and I've heard percentages like 30%. We have the ability to do other things, but for the approach the Patriot takes, it's particularly difficult. You got to get a satellite, a missile on the ground way up, far away from you, and it's just a very difficult thing to do. We can send men to the moon, but we can't do really missile defense now.
Well, we haven't sent anybody to the moon in a long time.
Was that guy's name Postal?
Yes, it was.
I just had a
That's
comment.
fascinating.
Someone said
Sure.
the IDF claims an 85 to 90% success rate for the Iron Dome and intercepting incoming projectiles. He wanted me to say that out loud.
Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Maybe it's past 10:30. Unless anyone has, I think we should end on a final question someone sent me, just because we're running late. In the future, what do you have your eyes on, John? What's your best guess for the big software failure in the next couple of years?
Oh my gosh. First of all, I hope there's no major software failure in the next couple of years. I mean, I think we all sort of see from our daily lives. I mean, we're on a Zoom call. I mean, this is all being routed through fiber optic cables. I mean, utilizing technology all over the world. I mean, software is everywhere, and software is probably growing exponentially and getting more complicated every single day. What is the next software failure going to be? I mean, honestly, I think, unfortunately, take your pick. I mean, I will say that in a lot of systems, I suspect medical devices, the software failure is going to be relatively, I'm sure they will happen, but I suspect in a lot of systems like the Therac, that probably will not happen, but you may see other systems where that failures. I mean, what I would not be surprised by is if you're going to see software failures on sort of older infrastructure systems, like maybe the electrical grid. Sort of, there was a major blackout. I think it was like 1993 that was actually caused by a software failure. You know, in the electrical grid, there's been a lot of issues, some software, some not, some cybersecurity. I mean, realistically, I think the major software issues over the next few years will largely be based around cybersecurity issues, is where I think that's really where, unfortunately, a lot of things are happening. And I think, you know, I see from my personal experience, everybody wants every device to be connected to the internet. I mean, you see, I mean, tractors working on farms are now IoT. You know, I'm sure people have maybe not. People are sort of familiar with like the IoT, like the Internet of Things. Everything is now going to be connected to the internet, and sort of that's one of the major drivers of 5G rollout worldwide. So I think cybersecurity is really going to play a major issue with everything, especially with infrastructure, various infrastructure issues. So that's kind of my suspicion. But I hope I'm wrong, and I hope everybody's learned their lesson. But I suspect some will and some won't. So that's probably it.
Thank you so much, John. A great guess someone sent to me was election fraud.
Election fraud is fascinating, and I listened to actually a great podcast with a group of people who are actually working on election issues, and it's really fascinating the work that's actually being done for election systems. That while election fraud is theoretically possible, there are a lot of people working behind the scenes to make it very secure over the next 5, 10, I don't know the timeline, but I'm guessing, 10 to 15 years.
All right, any last comments or questions? I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
Pleased to welcome you here.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you.